Saturday morning, 7 a.m, Daily Bible Time. Dominic, Steele here, and we're in Matthew 26, 49 to 56. And what are we to think of holy war? I mean, physical violence in the name of God. See, the place of violence in the Christian life is one of the key issues raised by the section of Matthew's Gospel that we're looking at this morning. If you look at Matthew 26:51, with that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it out, struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. It would seem like the companion, Peter, intends to kill the high priest's servant. Now, there have been questions earlier raised about the loyalty of Peter. Peter had been under pressure. Jesus had put Peter under pressure, and 3 times you'll deny me before the cock crows. Peter, we read in another gospel account, he's the one who takes out his sword and cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest. It's violence used in defense of Jesus. And you might think, if ever there was a cause, a religious cause, when it would be right to use violence, surely it would be now. I mean, Jesus is innocent. We know he's innocent. We know he won't be given a fair hearing. Protect him. And yet Jesus says, Matthew 26:52, put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Now, that is very different to the line from the Islamic prophet Muhammad. He says, the sword is the key of heaven and hell. A drop of blood shed in the cause of Allah, a night spent in arms, is of more avail than 2 months of fasting or prayer. Jesus says, put the sword away. Why? Jesus says, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. What does that mean, apart from violent people meet violent deaths? Well, if you think back to Genesis 9, there's a famous passage about the status of human life. Genesis 9:5. As for your lifeblood, I'll surely demand an accounting. I'll demand an accounting from every animal and from each man too. I'll demand an accounting for the life of his fellow man. And whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has God made man. And that last sentence in Genesis, it's the key one. No sin shows a greater contempt for human life than homicide or murder. An animal's blood, that can be killed, but a human's blood, well, that must not be shed. Why is it such a bad thing to shed a human's blood? It's because we humans are made in the image of God. And so God decreed in the Old Testament that if a person killed, well, then they themselves were to be killed. Now, I've racked my brains on this one, and I have to say, I haven't been able to come up with an argument against the death penalty from the Bible. I'm not saying I'm going to go out and argue for the reintroduction of it. I just can't find a Bible argument against it. But Peter is told by Jesus here, do not fight. Put your sword away. Do not take a life, because in the end you'll have your life taken. If you kill, you'll be killed. Now, if you flick forward from Genesis to Revelation, the same passage is alluded to. It's the passage advising the Christian on how to handle it under persecution from the state. Revelation 13, let me give it to you, Revelation 13:5. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints, against the Christians, and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe and people and language and nation, and all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. Everyone will be worshipping the beast. Everyone except, keep reading, Revelation 13:8, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear to hear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he'll go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he'll be killed. There's our verse again. And how is the Christian to act under that kind of persecution? Well, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Let me make this concrete. There's all sorts of anti-Jesus behaviour. Some of it awfully offensive. some of it scandalous insults to the person I most love. And I identify with the motive, the feeling of those people who might want to reply with violence. But if I am to honour Jesus, I will not act that way. I might be tempted to be like Peter, but Jesus has put the sword away. I'm to live with it. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints. I'm not to take up arms to protect Christ. Why? Well, Matthew 26:53, Jesus says, "Do you not think that I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels?" Of course he can. God is the one in authority. Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus has at his disposal extraordinary authorities. He doesn't need me to take up my sword. But more than that, Jesus tells me not to take up my sword. When faced with an attack on Christ, I'm not to respond with physical violence. I'm to respond, Revelation 13:10, with patient endurance and faithfulness. So is there ever a time when it's right to draw the sword? Well, yes, the government officer. The government officer carries a sword. In Romans 13, to administer justice, Romans 13:3, rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right and he'll commend you. He's God's servant to do you good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. He does not bear the sword for nothing. He's God's servant, agent of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. So, flowing from that argument, as the government attempts to bring justice and to rule rightly, it might decide to use the sword. It might decide to commit a nation to war as a matter of security or a matter of safety or a matter of defending the country. I don't think Jesus is speaking against that situation when he says put down the sword. So I actually don't think Jesus is a pacifist, but I do not think it's right to carry arms in defense of Jesus. So what place for holy war? I think from the words of Jesus and from Revelation and from Genesis 9, no place for holy war. I think the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church in the Crusades were wrong in the 11th century, just as Peter was wrong in the 1st century. And the word of Christ comes echoing down the centuries when I'm attacked. When it comes to war in the name of Jesus, his word is, put your sword away. The New Testament primary documents of Christianity are unambiguous. There's no place for holy war.